The case of Darren and Charla Mack is a shocking story that unfolded in Reno, Nevada. Amanda Robb, a writer from Reno, describes the case as follows. In Reno, you can probably get married and divorced in the same week and lose everything in a matter of minutes. The story of Darren and Charla Mack is a tale of explosive love. Good-looking people, lots of money, lots of sex, and high emotions, and ultimately murder. Darren Roy Mack was born on January 31st, 1961 in Reno, Nevada. He grew up in a wealthy family that owned a successful pawn shop. Darren learned the basics of the business from a young age. At 7, he began working in the family business, Palace Jewelry and Loan. His childhood in northern Nevada was characterized by outdoor activities, particularly hunting, which he learned alongside his brother Landon. Darren attended public schools in Reno and graduated from Reno High School. Thanks to his athletic abilities, he received a baseball scholarship to the University of Nevada. During his studies, he continued to work in the family business and developed a keen business sense. The turning point in Darren's life came in 1986, when his father died in a tragic plane crash. At just 25 years old, Darren suddenly became co-owner of the family business. He proved to be a skilled businessman and further expanded the pawn shop. Under his leadership, the business flourished, and Darren became a well-known figure in Reno's business world. Amanda Robb describes Darren. Darren Mack is good-looking, larger than life, very charismatic. He was an extremely wealthy man. He worked in and around gambling and owned a pawn shop. By 2006, Mack's annual income was estimated at about $500,000, and his net worth was approximately $9.4 million. Darren was also politically active and founded the Nevada Pawnbroker Association. He was known for his interest in self-improvement and regularly attended seminars to achieve his goals, which primarily revolved around money. Charla Marie Samsel was born on September 16, 1967, and also grew up in Reno. Unlike Darren, she dreamed of a career in the entertainment industry. After graduating from high school, she moved to Los Angeles to pursue an acting career. Charla had some minor roles in Hollywood. In a film with Drew Barrymore, she had a bit part where she pushed a hospital cart. In a documentary with Diane Keaton, she had a brief appearance talking about her faith. However, the big break never came, and Charla eventually returned to Reno. Friends described Charla as a stunningly beautiful brunette, absolutely gorgeous woman. She was the most positive, friendliest, happiest person you'd ever meet. Darren and Charla met in Reno in the mid-90s. Their attraction was immediately palpable. A friend recalls, Darren and Charla Mack were quite an explosive cocktail, passionate and volatile, with not much in between. At this time, Darren had already been married once. His first marriage to Deborah Ashlock began in 1986. They had 2 children together, a son named Jory and a daughter named Jacqueline. The marriage ended in divorce in 1991. The divorce from Deborah was bitter and prolonged. Darren fought fiercely for custody of his children and reportedly spent more than $250,000 on legal fees. On May 13, 1995, Darren and Charla got married. Their wedding was a social event in Reno. The couple seemed perfect for each other. A friend says, "Everyone loved Darren. He had this personality where you wanted to be around him." In the early years of their marriage, everything seemed to be going perfectly. They traveled the world, attended exclusive parties, and enjoyed life to the fullest. Darren bought Charla expensive gifts, diamonds, designer clothes, luxury cars. They lived in a large house in one of the best areas of Reno. But beneath the shiny surface, things were simmering from the start. Both were strong and dominant, and conflicts were common. Their arguments were loud and often emotional. Friends described their relationship as explosive. When it was good, it was very good, but when it was bad, it was catastrophic. A particularly controversial aspect of their marriage was their involvement in the swinger scene. An acquaintance recounts, they became regulars in the strip club circuit in Reno. Then it progressed to swinging. They actually went to swinger conventions in California, Arizona, and Mexico, where there were group sex parties. They called it sexing. On May 18, 1997, their daughter Erica was born. The birth of their daughter initially seemed to bring the couple even closer together. Darren was even featured in a local advertising campaign as Father, Husband of the Year. From the outside, they appeared to be the perfect family. However, after Erica's birth, Charla's attitude began to change. A friend reports, Erica had a very normal life with her mother. Movies, playdates, sleepovers, parties. That was Charla's life. Charla wanted to focus more on her role as a mother and increasingly withdrew from the swinger scene. She told Darren that she was no longer interested in that lifestyle. This discrepancy in their desires and values became a growing source of conflict. Charla accused Darren of spending more time in strip clubs than with his family. Darren felt controlled by Charla and restricted in his freedom. Their arguments became more frequent and intense. A friend recalls, she admitted that she had done some things she wasn't proud of in an attempt to save her marriage. They became increasingly involved in adventurous sex during their marriage. During this time, both began to accuse each other of violence. Charla claimed that Darren had become verbally and physically violent. She wrote in a letter to him, "I've told you time and time again, if you don't stop physically and verbally attacking me, I would divorce you." Darren, on the other hand, kept a diary in which he portrayed Charla as the aggressor. He claimed she had hit him, scratched his car, and humiliated him in front of his friends. A friend of Darren's, Michael Small, says, Darren was physically abused by his wife. I was with him a few times when she called and threatened him. The situation continued to escalate. Charla began to fear for her safety. She confided in friends, "He's out to get me, and will probably kill me one day." Darren, on the other hand, claimed he was wearing a bulletproof vest and carrying a gun out of fear of Charla. In February 2005, Charla finally filed for divorce. What followed was one of the bitterest and ugliest divorce proceedings Reno had ever seen. An observer comments, "In a state known for divorces, this was pretty much the ugliest divorce you can imagine." The dispute mainly revolved around 2 points: money and custody of Erica. Charla demanded a substantial portion of Darren's assets. She argued that she was entitled to half of the wealth acquired during the marriage. Darren vehemently opposed these demands. He claimed that his wealth came mostly from the family business, which he had inherited before the marriage. He argued that Charla had no claim to this money. Custody of Erica was another hotly contested point. Both parents wanted primary custody. Charla argued that she was the primary caregiver for Erica, and that Darren's lifestyle was not in the child's best interest. Darren, on the other hand, claimed that he was the more stable parent and could provide Erica with a better life. Judge Chuck Weller was assigned to the case. The court proceedings were tense from the start. Darren and Charla sat on opposite sides of the courtroom, avoiding any eye contact and communicating only through their lawyers. The atmosphere was so charged that the judge had to intervene several times to calm tempers. Charla's lawyers presented her as a devoted mother who had suffered for years under Darren's controlling and sometimes violent behavior. They presented emails and letters in which Charla expressed her fear of Darren. Witnesses, including friends and family members, confirmed Charla's portrayal of a turbulent and often frightening marriage. Darren's lawyers painted a completely different picture. They portrayed Darren as a successful businessman and loving father who had become a victim of Charla's manipulations and violence. They presented Darren's diary entries in which he detailed incidents where Charla had allegedly become violent. Darren also brought witnesses who supported his version of events. A particularly controversial point in the proceedings was the question of marital assets. Darren claimed that his business had fallen on hard times, and that his wealth was substantially less than Charla assumed. He argued that he was not able to make the support payments Charla was demanding. Charla's lawyers doubted this portrayal. They claimed Darren was trying to hide assets to minimize payments to Charla. They demanded a thorough review of Darren's finances, which led to lengthy and costly forensic investigations. Judge Weller tried to find a middle ground. He ordered Darren to pay Charla a one-time payment of $480,000 and an additional $10,000 per month in support. Darren felt this decision was unfair and ruinous. A friend recalls, "He was angry at the court system. Darren is someone who doesn't like to lose. Losing is unacceptable to him." Throughout the proceedings, Darren increasingly showed signs of stress and instability. He often appeared agitated and confused in the courtroom. His behavior became increasingly unpredictable, posing great challenges for his lawyers. Charla, on the other hand, tried to remain calm and composed. She focused on being there for Erica and trying to provide her with as normal a life as possible. But she too suffered from the stress of the lengthy proceedings. The situation escalated further when Darren began to publicly criticize Judge Weller. He claimed the judge was biased and unfair. In an interview for a local cable show, Darren went so far as to compare family court to Nazi Germany. In the weeks leading up to June 12, 2006, there were signs that Darren was on the verge of a breakdown. He became increasingly paranoid and spoke of the system being against him. Friends noticed a change in his behavior, but no one anticipated how far he would go. On the morning of June 12, 2006, the day began like any other in Reno. As usual, Charla brought Erica to Darren. What was meant to be a routine handover would prove to be Charla's last journey. Exactly what happened in the next few hours remains unclear to this day. What we do know is that Charla's lifeless body was later found in Darren's garage. The autopsy revealed that Charla had been stabbed 7 times. The wounds indicated an angry, emotional attack. Charla's body was found in a fetal position, a final desperate attempt to protect herself. But the horror of this day was not over yet. Shortly after 11 o'clock in the morning, a shot rang out through downtown Reno. The target was family court judge Chuck Weller, who was working in his office in the courthouse. A bullet pierced the window and hit the judge in the chest. Detective Ron Chalmers reports, "The 911 call came in just after 11:06 about a sniper at the courthouse. Hundreds of police officers locked down the city, while SWAT teams searched for the shooter." Martha Bellisel, a reporter for the Reno Gazette, recalls, "There were people hiding in various shops and restaurants. They were trying to get people off the street because they didn't know if the shooter would continue firing." The police responded immediately. Within minutes, downtown Reno was cordoned off. SWAT teams combed the area searching for the shooter. Witnesses reported seeing a person fleeing from a parking garage across from the courthouse. Meanwhile, Judge Weller was taken to the hospital. Fortunately, his injuries were not life-threatening. Nevertheless, the message was clear. This was not a random act of violence, but a targeted attack on a judge. Investigators didn't take long to make the connection between Charla Mack's murder and the attack on Judge Weller. All trails led to one man, Darren Mack. A nationwide manhunt was launched. Darren's face appeared on television screens across America. The authorities warned that he was armed and dangerous. Detective Ron Chalmers further reports, "We know the judge was shot at 11:05, and the vehicle fled the parking garage immediately." For 10 days, Darren Mack remained missing. The police pursued leads in several states and even in Mexico. There were unconfirmed reports of sightings at a resort in San Jose del Cabo, Mexico. A hotel employee, Virginia Delgadillo, claimed she had met a man matching Darren's description. A plane pilot staying at the same resort also reported believing he had seen the fugitive millionaire. Finally, exactly 1 week after his disappearance, shocking news came that Darren Mack wanted to surrender from his hideout in Mexico. He contacted District Attorney Dick Gamick, a longtime friend of the Mack family, by phone and expressed his desire to turn himself in. After days of negotiations, Darren finally agreed to surrender the next morning at the U.S. consulate in Puerto Vallarta. He was arrested on June 22nd at a luxury hotel in Puerto Vallarta. He was carrying $36,000 in cash, 20 credit cards, and a suitcase full of evidence, including a pair of shoes with blood spatter and other clothing items with apparent blood stains. The trial of Darren Mack began in October 2007 and drew nationwide attention. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, DNA traces, witness testimonies, and even a handwritten to-do list that was interpreted as a script for the crimes were presented. Prosecutor Christopher Lally described the case as one with all the hallmarks of overwhelming evidence. He elaborated, "When you look at the DNA evidence, the witness testimonies, the fingerprints, all the forensic things people look for in a case, this one had them." Mack's defense team initially tried to argue a combination of self-defense and temporary insanity. They argued that Charla had been the aggressor and that Darren had acted in a state of extreme emotional distress. However, midway through the trial, Darren surprised everyone by pleading guilty to Charla's murder and entering an Alford plea regarding the attempted murder of Judge Weller. An Alford plea allows a defendant to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the evidence would be sufficient for a conviction. This sudden turn of events shocked many. Some saw it as an admission of guilt. Others suspected it was a tactical decision to avoid a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But just a few weeks later, Darren tried to withdraw his confession. He fired his lawyers and claimed he had been forced into the confession. This led to further delays and legal maneuvering. In a private meeting, Darren Mack even thanked the men who were trying to convict him. Prosecutor Robert Daskus recalls, "Darren Mack shook our hands and thanked us for being professional and behaving like gentlemen." In the end, Judge Douglas Herndon decided to reject Darren's attempt to withdraw his confession. On January 28, 2008, Darren Mack was sentenced to life in prison for Charla's murder, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Additionally, he received 40 years for the attempted murder of Judge Weller, to be served after the life sentence. The sentence brought legal closure to the case, but the emotional wounds remained open. For Charla's family and friends, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served, but nothing could bring Charla back. For Erica, who was only 9 years old at the time of the murder, a new chapter full of challenges began. She had lost both parents in a single day, her mother through murder, her father through his actions. She became the center of a bitter custody battle between her grandparents. In 2007, an agreement was reached regarding custody and financial matters related to Charla's estate. The agreement stipulated that Charla's mother, Surya Townley, would have primary custody, while Darren's mother, Joan Mack, was also involved in the custody arrangement. They shared custody on a weekly rotation. Darren Mack was ordered to pay $1,500 per month in child support from his bankruptcy estate. The Mack case left deep scars in the Reno community. It showed the dark side of a city known for quick weddings and divorces. It revealed the destructive effects of bitterness and revenge in divorce cases. For the legal system, the case was a wake-up call. It highlighted the dangers that family court judges face and led to increased security measures in courts across the country. Judge Weller, who survived the attack, later spoke publicly about his experiences. He emphasized the need for reforms in the family law system and called for more support for judges and other judicial employees who often face highly emotional and potentially dangerous situations. In the years following the trial, there were repeated attempts to reopen the case. Darren's supporters, including some members of his family, argued that he had not received a fair trial. They claimed that important evidence had not been considered and that Darren had been the victim of a conspiracy. Darren's son, Jory, who was a teenager at the time of the murder, made several public appearances in the following years to assert his father's innocence. He claimed that his father had acted in self-defense and had been the victim of a corrupt legal system. Meanwhile, Charla's family tried to cope with the loss and secure Erica's future. Charla's mother, Surya Townley, became the primary caregiver for Erica. She struggled to provide her granddaughter with as normal a life as possible, despite the trauma she had experienced. The question of how to convey the truth about her parents to Erica was a constant challenge. How do you explain to a child that her father murdered her mother? The family opted for a gentle approach, gradually providing Erica with more information as she grew older. In the years following the murder, there were several memorial events for Charla. Friends and family remembered her zest for life, her radiant smile, and her love for her daughter. These events served not only to honor Charla's memory, but also as a reminder against domestic violence. The case also had implications for Reno's business world. The Mack family's pawn shop, once a thriving business, fell on hard times. The Mack name, which once commanded respect and prestige, was now associated with tragedy and violence. In the courtrooms of Reno and beyond, the Mack case became a textbook example of the dangers of escalating divorce proceedings. Lawyers and judges studied the case to learn lessons from it and prevent similar tragedies in the future. For many in the Reno community, the case remained a puzzle. How could a man like Darren Mack, who seemed to have everything, wealth, success, a beautiful family, resort to such extreme violence? The answers to this question were complex and multifaceted. Some saw Darren as an example of toxic masculinity, a man who couldn't handle losing control. Others saw him as a victim of a legal system he perceived as unfair. Still, others viewed him as someone suffering from an undiagnosed mental illness. The case also raised questions about the role of media in such high-profile cases. The intense coverage of the case, which was often sensationalistic and speculative, was criticized by some. There were concerns that the media attention might have influenced the trial and possibly even contributed to the escalation of the situation. In the years following the trial, there were several documentaries and books about the case. Each attempted to unravel the complex story of Darren and Charla Mack and understand the events that led to this tragedy. One of these documentaries, Paying with Blood, attracted particular attention. It not only illuminated the details of the case, but also the broader societal issues it raised, from domestic violence to the question of how the legal system handles highly contentious divorce cases. The case also had implications for Nevada's political landscape. It led to discussions about possible reforms in family law and increased security measures for judges and court employees. Some politicians used the case to advocate for stricter laws against domestic violence. Behind prison walls, Darren Mack's story continued. Reports about his life behind bars occasionally appeared in the media. Some described him as remorseful and reformed, others as bitter and unrepentant. The truth was likely more complex than any of these portrayals. For the people who knew and loved Charla, the pain of her loss persisted over the years. Friends remembered her zest for life, her infectious laugh, and her generosity. They spoke of how Charla was always there for others, and how much she loved her daughter Erica. Erica's journey was particularly challenging. As she grew older, she had to deal not only with the loss of her parents, but also with the knowledge of the terrible circumstances of this loss. Reports suggested that despite everything, she showed remarkable resilience and tried to build her own life, away from the shadow of her parents' tragedy. The Mack case remained a topic of conversation in Reno for years after the events. It became a kind of urban legend, a story told to new residents to illustrate the dark side of the biggest little city in the world. For many in the community, the case was a wake-up call. It showed that domestic violence and toxic relationships can occur in all social strata, even among couples who appear perfect on the outside. It led to increased efforts to support victims of domestic violence and provide resources for people in difficult relationships. The case also had implications for how divorce proceedings were handled in Nevada and beyond. Lawyers and judges became more sensitized to the signs of escalating conflicts and the need to intervene early to prevent tragedies. In fathers' rights circles, which Darren had joined before his crime, the case was the subject of heated debates. Some saw Darren as an extreme example of the frustration men can experience in the family law system. Others vehemently distanced themselves from his actions and emphasized that violence can never be a solution. The case also shone a spotlight on the swinger scene in Reno and other cities. While Darren and Charla's sexual practices were only one aspect of their complex relationship, the case led to discussions about the potential impacts of such lifestyles on marriages and families. In the years following the murder, there were several attempts to honor Charla's life and legacy. A foundation was established in her name, dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence. Annual memorial events remembered her life and called for vigilance against domestic violence. The Mack case also became a popular topic in true crime podcasts and television shows. Each new treatment of the subject brought a flood of comments and speculation, evidence of how much the case continued to captivate the public imagination. For the justice officials who had worked on the case, it remained a formative experience. Many spoke in the following years about how the case had changed their view of their work and the legal system in general. Prosecutor Christopher Lally, who led the case against Darren Mack, reflected years later on the experience. He emphasized how important it is to remain professional and objective in such emotionally charged cases, while also not losing sight of the human tragedy behind them. Judge Weller, who survived the attack, used his experience to advocate for changes in the justice system. He campaigned for better security measures for judges and spoke openly about the emotional challenges family court judges face. The case also had implications for how media report on domestic violence and divorce cases. Journalists became increasingly aware of the complexity of such cases and the need to report on them sensitively and responsibly. In criminal defense circles, the Mack case became a frequently discussed example of the challenges in defending high-profile, emotionally charged cases. Darren's sudden decision to plead guilty and his later attempt to withdraw this plea were seen as textbook examples of the complexity of such cases. For the police officers who were first on the scene on the day of the murder, the events remained a lifelong trauma. Many spoke in the following years about how the case had changed their view of their profession and the darkness humans are capable of. The case also led to discussions about the role of mental health in criminal proceedings. Some experts argued that Darren Mack's behavior showed signs of an undiagnosed mental illness. This led to debates about how the justice system could better address the mental health needs of defendants. In the years following the murder, there were several scientific studies that used the Mack case as a case study. These studies examined various aspects of the case, from the psychology of domestic violence to the dynamics of high-conflict divorces. The case also had implications for how couple therapy and marriage counseling were practiced in Reno and beyond. Therapists became aware of the need to recognize signs of escalating violence early and respond appropriately. In women's rights circles, the Mack case was often cited as an example of how dangerous it can be for women to extricate themselves from abusive relationships. It led to increased efforts to provide protection and support for women in such situations. The case also had implications for Reno's business world. The city's image as a place for quick weddings and equally quick divorces was shaken. Tourism experts worked hard to rehabilitate the city's image and present it as more than just a divorce capital. In pawnbroker circles, to which Darren Mack once belonged, the case was received with dismay. Many distanced themselves from Darren and emphasized that his actions were not representative of their industry. The case also led to discussions about the role of guns in cases of domestic violence. The fact that Darren possessed a gun and used it against both Charla and Judge Weller led to calls for stricter gun laws, especially for individuals involved in divorce proceedings. In bodybuilder and fitness enthusiast circles, to which Darren once belonged, the case was received with dismay. Some used the case as a warning about the potential negative effects of steroids and other performance-enhancing substances on behavior and emotional stability. The case also had implications for how schools deal with children whose parents are involved in high-conflict divorces. Teachers and school counselors were sensitized to the signs of stress and trauma in such children. In the years following the murder, there were several attempts to adapt the Mack case for films and television series. However, these projects often met with resistance from Charla's family and friends, who feared that such portrayals would sensationalize the case and not do justice to Charla's memory. The case also led to discussions about the ethical responsibilities of lawyers in high-conflict divorce cases. Some argued that lawyers should play a greater role in de-escalating conflicts and encourage their clients to seek peaceful solutions. In criminology circles, the Mack case became a popular research topic. It was studied as an example of the complex factors that can lead to extreme violence in familial situations. The case also had implications for how insurance companies assessed risks in divorce cases. Some companies began offering special insurance policies for judges and other judicial employees dealing with high-conflict cases. In psychology and psychiatry circles, the case led to increased research on the psychological impacts of divorce, particularly on men. Some experts argued that there needed to be more support and resources for men who have difficulty dealing with the emotional aspects of divorce. The Mack case also became a topic in legal seminars and lectures. Law students studied the case as an example of the complex legal and ethical questions that can arise in high-conflict family law cases. In social worker circles, the case led to increased efforts to better support families in crisis situations. New protocols were developed to identify high-conflict cases early and respond appropriately. The case also had implications for how courts deal with threats against judges and other judicial employees. Many courts revised their security protocols and installed additional protective measures. In victim rights organization circles, the Mack case was often cited as an example of how important it is to hear the voices of victims in criminal proceedings. Some argued that Charla's earlier warnings about Darren's behavior should have been taken more seriously. The case also led to discussions about the role of communities in preventing domestic violence. Some argued that friends, family, and neighbors have a greater responsibility to intervene when they notice signs of abuse or escalating violence. In mediation expert circles, the Mack case was cited as an example of how important it is to involve neutral third parties in divorce cases. Some argued that more intensive mediation might have helped to de-escalate the conflict between Darren and Charla. The case also had implications for how companies deal with employees going through difficult divorces. Some companies began offering special support programs for employees in such situations. In child and adolescent psychologist circles, the case led to increased research on the effects of high-conflict divorces on children. Erica Mack's case was often cited as an example of how traumatic such situations can be for children. The Mack case also became a topic in courses on journalism and media ethics. It was used as an example of how important it is to report sensitively and responsibly on cases of domestic violence. In correctional expert circles, the case led to discussions about the rehabilitation of domestic violence perpetrators. Some argued that more needed to be done to address the underlying causes of such violence and prevent repeat offenses. The case also had implications for how communities organize memorial events for victims of domestic violence. In Reno and beyond, annual events were established to remember Charla and other victims and raise awareness of the issue. In forensic expert circles, the case led to increased research on the forensic aspects of domestic violence cases. The Mack case was often used as an example of how important thorough and careful forensic investigation is. The case also led to discussions about the role of personality disorders in cases of domestic violence. Some experts argued that Darren Mack's behavior showed signs of narcissistic personality disorder, leading to debates about the treatment of such disorders in the justice system. In family therapist circles, the Mack case was cited as an example of how important it is to offer comprehensive support to couples in crisis. Some argued that more intensive therapeutic interventions might have helped to de-escalate the situation. The case also had implications for how communities deal with the issue of gun ownership. In Reno and other cities, discussions about stricter gun laws were initiated, especially for individuals involved in divorce proceedings. In addiction expert circles, the case led to increased research on the connection between substance abuse and domestic violence. Some argued that Darren's alleged steroid use might have played a role in his violent actions. The Mack case also became a topic in courses on criminology and victimology. It was used as an example of how complex the dynamics in cases of domestic violence can be and how important it is to consider the perspectives of victims. In human rights activist circles, the case led to discussions about the rights of women in divorce proceedings. Some argued that the case demonstrated the need for stronger legal protections for women in such situations. The case also had implications for how communities deal with the issue of mental health. In Reno and other cities, efforts were intensified to raise awareness of mental health issues and improve access to relevant services. In criminology circles, the Mack case was often cited as an example of possessive killing. This type of crime, where one partner kills the other because they don't want to lose them, became the subject of intensive research. The case also led to discussions about the role of gender stereotypes in cases of domestic violence. Some experts argued that traditional notions of masculinity and control might have contributed to Darren's violent behavior. In education expert circles, the Mack case was cited as an example of how important it is to educate young people about healthy relationships and conflict resolution. Some argued that such educational programs could help prevent future cases of domestic violence. The case also had implications for how communities deal with trauma recovery. In Reno and other cities, special programs were launched to support people traumatized by cases of extreme violence. In sociology circles, the case led to increased research on the social factors that can contribute to domestic violence. The Mack case was often used as an example of how complex social dynamics can lead to tragic outcomes. The case also became a topic in courses on crisis management and public safety. It was used as an example of how important it is to respond quickly and effectively to crisis situations and appropriately inform the public. In legal philosophy circles, the case led to discussions about the limits of justice in cases of extreme violence. Some argued that the case highlighted the difficulties of finding justice in situations where the harm is irreparable. The Mack case also had implications for how communities deal with the issue of forgiveness and reconciliation. In Reno and other cities, discussions were initiated about how communities can heal after such tragic events. In legal reform circles, the case led to calls for changes in family law. Some argued that the case demonstrated the need to make the divorce process less confrontational and more cooperative. The case also became a topic in courses on media psychology. It was used as an example of how intense media coverage of criminal cases can influence public perception and possibly even the course of events. In urban planner circles, the case led to discussions about the design of safe public spaces. The attack on Judge Weller in the courthouse led to considerations of how public buildings can be better secured without appearing unwelcoming. The Mack case remains a dark chapter in Reno's history, a reminder of how quickly seemingly perfect lives can turn into tragedies. It is a warning for society to remain vigilant against the signs of domestic violence and to provide the necessary resources to prevent such tragedies in the future. Ultimately, the case of Darren and Charla Mack is a story without winners. It shows the devastating consequences of uncontrolled emotions and the need to resolve conflicts peacefully. It's a story that will long be remembered as a warning and a lesson for future generations.